Hello, and welcome to episode 27 of Poetry Worth Hearing, hosted by me, Kathleen McPhillamy, and with music by Alex Heen. This episode had the theme of canonical, and I was looking for work which explored the idea of the canon and of its relevance, whatever it is, to the present day. I was fortunate to interview Helen Eastman, the founder of Live Canon, whose work with poetry in theatre and publishing has pursued just such a quest. Then John Greening, a poet whose work is steeped in the poetry of the past, gives an extended reading. It's been interesting that most of the challenge to the received idea of the canon have come from a feminist perspective. Laura Varnam reads some of her poems which give a voice to Grendel's mother. Other poems come from Matt Bryden, Beck Reynolds, Margot Myers, Nick Grundy, Rosie Jackson, and Inge Milfull. It's a huge pleasure to hear Helen Eastman, human dynamo if ever there was one, talking about her work. She has done an immense amount for poets at grassroots and above, as well as putting tireless efforts into bringing poetry to a wider audience.
Live Canon actually had quite an unusual genesis as an organisation and quite an anecdotal way of telling the story is the only way into it, really. I had studied literature and then trained as a theatre director, and I think when I started out as a theatre director, I imagined I would spend a lot of time working with and grappling with text. But actually, my career had taken quite a different direction. And there was a phase where I was directing a lot of opera, and then there was a phase where I was working a lot in what we might loosely call physical theatre or dance theatre or visual theatre. I just directed a circus, and it had been a really long time since I'd actually grappled with words. And I was in a pub with James Hedrell, who was and still is the artistic director of Greenwich Theatre. We were having a sprawling chat about poetry and text and literature, and various things came up. One was I said I'd really like to direct some words, and secondly we were talking about how the experience of poetry gets very fragmented between the old and the new, because often we encounter the old on the page and increasingly we encounter the new orally as more and more poetry is performed. And I mean both performance poetry and poetry that's being published in the contemporary arena, where there's much more of a focus now on readings and events and festivals. So we quite often encounter the new orally. And I would say it's quite hard to draw lines sometimes between poems that we only see on the page and poems that we hear. And so we came up with this idea that we would perform basically the back canon of English poetry. And this was about 15 years ago. I think there are more people doing it now, but at the time that wasn't something you could book a ticket to go and watch. So we agreed that I would direct a series of performances at Greenwich Theatre. We put it in the diary pretty much straight away, one a month for about 6 months, covering the back canon of English literature in our, 3 pints downstate. I'm not sure what we meant by that at the time, but we loosely had to come up with the names of these performances. So I went for metaphysicals, romantics, war poets, Bloomsbury Group, something vaguely London themed, and there must have been one other. So we came up with these broad categories. And I then pulled together a group of actors that I loved and trusted to think about sort of stylistically what that might look like in performance. And I was pretty committed to the idea that it would all be done from memory and that the performers would just come out on stage and perform an hour of material. And we would rehearse that with the care and the diligence with which you would rehearse a play. So we weren't going to just sort of rock up and wing it. So pulled together some actors that I knew and trusted, and I'd just done something for the National Studio at that point, so quite a few people came from that project, and we spent some time just working initially on the metaphysicals and thinking about what it meant to hear those poems and to experience those poems in a live context. We were really playing and just feeling around. At the time, we developed a performance convention where we didn't put the titles and the authors at the start of the poems just started, because often we felt that when you labelled something, if someone comes out and says, I'm going to perform the Ballad of Burdens by Algernon Swinburne, you already feel slightly stupefied before you've even started listening. Whereas actually, if someone just comes out and delivers the opening line and starts telling you a poem or telling you a story, often you just listen with no real sense of period or time. The time between you and the poet just sort of drops away, and it just becomes one person communicating with another. So we developed these shows, these sort of canonical shows, and obviously it was an opportunity for us to think about what the word canon meant, and we worked really hard to think about that in a diverse way. So, for example, our war poets show, almost half the poems are by women, and that is not the case of most war poetry anthologies. For example, the Faber book of political poetry has, I think, 3 out of 200 poems are by women. Our collection of political poetry doesn't look anything like that. So we were investigating what the canon meant to us. We were performing it live and from memory. And so we called the series Live Canon because that's what it was. Canon with one N, poems, not guns. And it was meant to be just a one-off event, really, that happened at Greenwich Theatre, 6 performances, 1 a month. But other theatres got interested in that idea and asked us if we'd repeat the series elsewhere. So the Bloomsbury, Exeter, Northcote, and a number of other organisations got in touch asking if we could do bits of it. The V&A wanted us to perform the Pre-Raphaelite collection as part of their Pre-Raphaelite exhibition that was opening at the time, and then they asked us if we could audio record those poems so they could make a sound installation in the V&A. So it started spiralling into multiple performances. We were then asked to make bespoke performances for the National Trust, commissioned a performance of poems about Victorian gardens. A festival commissioned us to do a whole show of poems by the sea. And we were loving it and learning a huge amount. You don't really know a poem until you've investigated it to the depth of knowing it by heart and living with it in your head and your body for a period of time. And actually having an ensemble of actors who was bodily carrying those poems through their days and their weeks was extraordinary. And flexing that muscle of learning poems and inhabiting poems and sharing them and performing them, I think we all found intoxicating and exhilarating. And I remember my young son coming home from school telling me they'd had Victorian Day at school and they'd all been made to learn a poem. And he thought this was hilarious, the idea that this was a Victorian, because he was like, my mum runs a whole company that's about people learning poems. So it's a really fascinating engagement with something that had become unfashionable and seen as old-fashioned, to learn, to recite, to know. And actually we found massively uplifting on every level. We found it quite hard to explain to people what it was and to market it, because it's really hard to explain to people just how amazing an experience it is to sit in a theatre and listen to people telling you poems really well. There was a bit of there's always a bit of kickback against everything, isn't it? There were people who told me that actors should never read poems and they were terrible at it, and and I was like, well, yeah, some of them are. Sometimes an actor reads a poem really badly. That doesn't mean that the idea of it is intrinsically bad. Some poets read poems really badly. So it was very much about. And I think because as a writer, I come from a theatre background. So I write a lot of plays, I write a lot of librettos, and it would never occur to me that I was the best person to perform every word that I write. I am not the best person to perform my plays. We were really free to think of what the actor brings to the text. And everybody came from a sort of theatre background, I guess, who was just quite used to the idea that a part of the journey of any text is the idea of somebody else performing it. So we were thoroughly enjoying that, and that's what the Live Canon organisation was at the time, the Live Canon Ensemble, and we were doing a lot of recording. And we started to want to work with contemporary poets as well. And we were approached around that time about doing a couple of shows with living writers, including Seamus Heaney and with Derek Walcott. And we started to think about what the relationship was of the organisation with new work. And one of the things we did was we started the Live Canon International Poetry Competition, and that was a poetry competition like any other, but the difference was that at the end of it, the 25 poems that were the final poems were performed at Greenwich Theatre in an event that was exactly the same in style and format as if we'd been performing an hour of Keats or we'd been performing an hour of Emily Dickinson. And people were really intrigued about entry. It was a different type of poetry competition because the end point was this rather glorious theatre show celebrating the work in a different format. But we also decided to bring out an anthology to go with it, and we learned how to do that. And suddenly we seem to have a publishing company as well. And we quickly catapulted from publishing an annual anthology to starting to publish collections and pamphlets and bespoke anthologies. And it led to a number of quite audacious publishing challenges, which really interrogated this relationship between the old and the new. So I would say a real highlight was the publication of 154, which we did in collaboration with the V&A, which was an anthology which contains all 154 of Shakespeare's sonnets and 154 poems by contemporary writers responding to each sonnet. So you get the sonnet on the left-hand page and the response on the right. If you can imagine trying to coordinate 154 poets to all hit the deadline and respond to the right sonnet, it was the spreadsheet to end all spreadsheets. But we got there, and we accompanied it with a marathon performance of the whole lot at the V&A, which lasted about 12 hours. So we were playing around, really, I think, with thinking about the relationship of our living poets to the canonical, and we frequently started to perform gigs where we mixed those things up and created relationships between living and dead writers. And we looked at that in lots of different formats. We went on to make a series of gallery installations. The very first one we did was almost 15 years ago now, Health Tips for the Year Ahead, which is a quote from an N.J. Hines poem. And we created an environment, a place that allowed poetry to give you life advice. And we had hundreds of poems in pill bottles that you could help yourself to. There were loads of filing cabinets where you could select poems based on, poems for a headache, poems for a hangover, poems for a broken heart. And that was about 15 years ago. We created that sort of space, and we toured that to a couple of art galleries. And then we created an installation based essentially around the work of Emily Dickinson, which had as its centerpiece the Emily Dickinson bath, where you could bath in the works of Emily Dickinson. Her poems were all written on little white balls, and you could sit and assemble them together and make new poems, make found poems out of the poetry around you. But in all of those installations, there were old poems and new poems, and an implicit dialogue between them as they faced each other on the wall or sat next to each other in a filing cabinet. And they were all interactive. People could add more poetry to the installations. So we were just really trying to interrogate that question of relationship between the old and the new, and the kind of continuity of human thought. I discovered I needed poems in my life for the reason that, for me, as somebody who's not religious, libraries are a very sort of numinous place, and they are where I go to think. And the history of poetry is the history of people trying to articulate really complex, difficult ideas or emotions or sensations or feelings or instincts, and trying to wrangle language to communicate that from one person to another. So poetry makes me feel a lot less alone, because when you look at shelves and shelves of poems, you see a history of other humans trying to communicate the things that you are feeling. And obviously a lot of thoughts are time and place specific, but a lot are also not and are intensely human. And so in that sense, looking across that broad sweep of people trying to communicate through language is, for me, a way of navigating life and a way of thinking about what it means to be human. And I think increasingly over the last 5 years, we've been reminded of the value of gathering people together to listen to words and to make space to listen to find quiet space in which to listen and reflect, and often to do that communally, to gather and do that. So I always feel that live canon performances or readings are about that. They're about us gathering people to stop and listen, or gathering people to stop and take time to sit with other people's words and thoughts. In lockdown, we ran a Friday reading series that extended through the whole of lockdown. I thought I'd do 4 of them or 6 of them, and I ended up doing 45 of them, I think, where at each one 3 or 4 poets read, and very simple format. But for a lot of people, it sort of metered their week during lockdown, that they always knew that was coming up on a Friday lunchtime, and it gave them things to think about over the week. So that ritual, I think, of gathering and listening is massively important and at the heart of what we do at Live Canon. I mean, I think some of the things we've published have really lent into that relationship between the old and the new. I think, for example, The Big Calls, Glyn Maxwell's book, which we published last year, actually uses the form of old poems to make new poems. So he takes the form poems from what we might think of as perhaps that most bombastic, dare I, male point in poetry, that the era of Kipling and Tennyson, and he uses the forms and structures of those poems to write poems of the now, and really speaking to, I think, the Johnson administration. He was writing about Grenfell, about the exit from Afghanistan, about asylum seekers, about boats in the Channel, but through the medium of those, echoing those poems. I can probably give you an example. I think every time the nation votes for their favourite poem, they tend to vote for Kipling's poem If, and this is Glynn's rewriting of it. If you would make an ugly thing look shiny, or make an aged thing look good as new, or engineer a saving, though it's tiny, to suit the corporation hiring you. If you would make it pretty from a distance, or come in under budget by the date. If you would hit your mark and meet resistance, by never meeting it till it's too late. Then you might turn your thoughts to aluminium, or polyethylene, or PIR. The cheaper stuff professional opinion knows will burn like fuel, but there you are. And once it burns, kill any who inhaled it, it being part composed of cyanide. Or if these compounds took a test and failed it, you might rename them slightly, let it slide. Or when the troublemakers make their trouble, prolong the work or pine for luxuries, like water sprinklers, hallways clear of rubble, lights that function, fripperies like these, you'll hear them out, but threaten legal action. None can fight. And if one night in bed they all stay put because of an instruction meant for buildings where a fire can't spread, you're not alone. In fact, you're one of many. Unnumbered are the ways to wink it through. Some are convenience, and most are money. Some what we did, most what we didn't do. Ours is not the world and all that's in it. Ours is how we live and if we care. Ours is everyone's last passing minute. Now you can't say you didn't meet them there. So for me, that's an example of how the old meets the new, and very much what live canon can be about, a response to the now that engages with a past sort of history of poetry. That said, a lot of the work that we publish is spanklingly and sparklingly brand new. We've just started a few interesting collaborations that use illustration in new and different ways. We published the late Mark Cuban's Agony, and the extraordinary illustrations for that were nominated for the World Illustration Awards. And we've just published Inge Hines' book, which responds to photography in the astronomical exhibition at Greenwich. And 10 extraordinary photographers gave us permission to reprint their astronomical photos alongside the poems. So I guess we're interested in books that are beautiful in and of themselves as objects, and that led to N.J. Hines' recent book, which is one of the only pamphlets I think probably ever to have a blurb on the back from the Astronomer Royal alongside the blurbs of lots of other poets. This pamphlet's quite recent, but actually N.J. Hines' collection, Department of Emotional Projections, was the first full collection that Live Canon published over a decade ago. And I often say that it was a statement in that it was exactly the kind of poetry we were interested in publishing, which was simultaneously human, witty, personable, and yet looking very broadly at the world we live in and how we interact it. That amazing balance between something that has enormous personal integrity, but also an outward lens to thinking about how we exist politically within the world. I love all the poems in NJ's collection, Tracking Light, Stacking Time, but this one's gorgeous. It's called Auroral Zone. I've never read this out loud. I want to be optimistic. The yellow lights of a village, red houses, snow-lapped mountains, the midnight wash of sky becoming a Mariel sea. The scene's ripe with sublime possibility. Soon, a wild green parakeet will spread its wings across the heavens, a lime umbrella, just as we were told and hoped. And we'll remind each other to breathe the icy air, but not too much, and watch as jade feathers twist and gleam, the sky a plumed parade before morning twilight begins. Then we'll check our eyes for sparks with a cold flashlight. It's why we're here. The cure. Now, I whisper. We fumble, adjusting Celadon filters, afraid that after, in the much prayed for after, no change will be seen. But yes, so that's a really sort of lovely journey in terms of her collection being the first full collection that we've published. I think we've published about 70 books now, and we keep sort of breaking the rules of what we do, which is exactly what you should do, right? As an independent publisher, you should be doing the stuff that nobody else is doing, because there's no point in duplicating what people can do in more robust institutions. And it's interesting. I was at a thing at the South Bank Centre recently where they'd invited 4 publishing companies to come and talk to aspiring writers. So I was on the panel with Bad Betty, 9 Arches, and Outspoken. And I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that those 3 publishers are all Arts Council funded and have a sort of permanent subsidy to do what they do. Live Canon absolutely doesn't. So we have to really think, therefore, about what we can do and what we contribute, because there are lots of things we can't do because we just don't have the funding, we don't have the money, we don't have the organisational structure, we don't have infrastructure, we don't have any permanent employees, we're all volunteers. So what can we do is often the unusual things, the fleet of foot things, for example, when Glyn sent us the manuscript for the big calls and said it was urgent because it spoke to the political moment, we got the book out within 6 weeks. That's not something a more conventional publishing house can do, just because they're tied into longer marketing timelines. There's no point in us having longer marketing timelines because we don't have a marketing department. It's interesting to think about what we can do that is provocative, alternative, inspirational, paradigm shifting, but how we do that without necessarily duplicating what else is there that can be done better by other people because they've got more funding and more resources to do it. Alongside the publishing, there is always the Live Canon ensemble. So there's always this relationship between performance and poems. And that's led to some brilliant relationships where actors have recorded poems for poets, and that's gone on to be a creative relationship where poets have actually started writing for the actors. We have a really rich YouTube channel that has hundreds and hundreds of videos on it, some of which are just, recordings of readings or recordings of events, but a lot of which are original material made for video where, we've done a lot of the poems on the GCSE syllabus to help young people with studying. There's a lot of performance there that brings poetry off the page and a lot of interesting collaborations. For example, there's a dance collaboration there where a audio recording we made of a Charlotte Mew poem, which is read by Alice Barkley, was then choreographed by Will Tuckett from the Royal Ballet and danced by Zinaida Janowski, who was principal at the Royal Ballet at the time. And so just cross-genre collaborations that bring poetry into people's lives in different ways, that make the work accessible for people in different ways. I would guess that thousands of our YouTube subscribers don't regularly buy poetry or don't know that they like poetry until the YouTube algorithm starts throwing up poems in their timeline and they watch a video here or a video there. And sometimes they come back because they like particular performers or they like particular strands of the work there. So we've thought a lot about how to engage outside of the poetry circle. I think it's a sad truth, but a lot of poetry publishing can be quite inwardly focused. A poetry book is published and the people who buy the poetry book are predominantly the community around the poet. And that is not a bad thing at all in terms of the richness of those communities, and nor is it any judgment on the quality of the work if it doesn't spread outside of that immediate bubble. But quite a lot of what Live Canon does is to cross-fertilize audiences and try and get poetry out more widely. So, for example, the people who might come to a poetry installation might come from a visual art background. We're doing a collaboration with Creation at the moment, which involves programming poets reading, but the majority of the Creation mailing list would be people who regularly go to the theatre rather than people who know that they like going to listen to poets. But we can draw them across and maybe they'll discover that they love listening to poets read live. So we're often engaging with other art forms as a way to share our audiences. And sometimes it's about surprising people. So one of my real highlights for Live Canon was when we created an installation on Oxford Street a couple of years ago, exactly at the point at which the Christmas lights were being switched on. So you can't imagine a more commercial environment than Christmas shopping on Oxford Street in central London, Christmas lights being switched on. There's gazillions of tired, harassed or excited shoppers. It's the least conducive environment to stopping or thinking. It's a completely commercial corporate environment. And we created an installation in the window of what had been a very, very large flagship Pret, I think, that had closed down, opposite Zara on Oxford Street, just on that very central bit, where we hung 6 poems in massive format in the windows of the building while it was temporarily empty. And we were working together with a really amazing art curatorial practice called the Koppel Project, which puts artists' work into abandoned or empty spaces. So these poems went up, and as I was hanging them, so imagine they're massive, they're the size of walls, and they're going into these windows on Oxford Street. People are starting to stop and read them, starting to stop and engage. And I saw this couple come, and they're carrying all their bags of shopping, and they stopped and they stood together and they read this poem as I was hanging it. It was slightly wonky, I hadn't quite got it straight. And they talked for a moment, and she cried, and he suggested they went and had a coffee. And you could see this all playing out. But actually, loads of people just paused for a few minutes in the middle of their shopping and read a poem. And that's a great sort of intervention or a cultural intervention into somebody's day. One of the poets whose work I think is extraordinary, who's an emerging sort of Indian American poet who's now in the UK, made this lovely video of herself in front of her poem, sort of saying that she was in the most sort of capitalist commercial place you could find in London, standing in front of her poem, which was on Oxford Street in the window. And in many ways, writing poems is the least capitalist thing, like the last bastion against capitalism in some ways. It's the most financially unproductive thing you could possibly do with your time. And how proud she was to be exhibited on Oxford Street in the middle of the Christmas shopping, and what an extraordinary sort of legacy that was. So Live Canon have a tendency to put poems in unexpected places. And we've done everything from distributing poems through cafe networks. We've had events where there've been poems literally hidden in the pies. We've put poems into contemporary Chinese poetry, into Chinese fortune cookies. We've found all kinds of ways to meet audiences and readers in different ways, and to encourage people to make poetry part of their day. We run lots of workshops and drop-in workshops and lots of outreach, and we do that for all kinds of organisations. One of my favourite outreach sessions was when we were asked to do something for the launch of the Pink Floyd exhibition at the V&A, and we did obviously a lot of the early Pink Floyd lyrics were created as cut-ups. They were going through their sort of Dadaist phase. So we had a massive cut-up poetry workshop, which we'd sort of thought was for the children, but actually all the adults were really up for it as well. And we had hundreds and hundreds of people on the V&A lawn making cut-up poems before they went into the Pink Floyd exhibition. And we run an annual children's poetry competition for children, mainly from the UK, but also, international entries as well. And we produce an anthology every year of 100 poems by young people, which I find really inspiring. We know that the future of poetry is safe when we read their brilliant work. And last year, the Live Canon Ensemble found themselves invited to the UN to perform at the UN session on climate justice, having collaborated with academics from 4 universities globally on performing in response to the climate specific areas of the climate crisis, climate and finance, climate and racism. And that was the point at which I thought, okay, I think maybe we peaked in terms of our impact, and now we could all possibly retire. We've done it. We're here. We're at the UN. We're in front of an audience of our 150 delegates to the UN. We were thanked the next day by country. So it's been an incredible journey, really, and we're about 15 years in. The question of what next, I think, is really open at the moment. I think, like all arts organisations, there's a massive imbalance between ideas and imagination and potential, and the rigors of and the endless grimness of fundraising, and trying to make sure that you can pay artists respectfully and fairly, and writers and poets, and that you can make participation in everything you do as accessible as possible, and all of those difficult financial equations. So things have felt quite difficult, I think, coming out of lockdown. I think during lockdown, all artists felt very valued for what they were being able to contribute to helping people stay positive in a really difficult time. And I think coming out the other end of that is really tricky, because I think there's less space, there's less funding, there's less attention to what artists, and there's also, all arts organisations are carrying debt and carrying the sort of, have all lost their, reserves and their stability. And I think we've got a way to go from sort of surviving to thriving, to use a sort of slightly naff phrase. We've got a journey to go on to get back to feeling sort of secure as an organisation, and working out how to the cultural landscape has shifted. But I think we're always trying to work out how to reset the agenda and rethink what a poetry organisation could be doing in this moment and how it could be engaging with language and readers and listeners. And for me, that involves looking back as well as looking forward and thinking about how we carry the legacy of the last couple of thousand years of the poetry into the future that we're making, and how we have those conversations. But I guess that's because that's what matters to me about poetry, is being able to look back in an almost religious way at this body of literature from thousands of years as a way to sort of navigate life as well as looking forward. And for me, it therefore can't just be about the now. It has to be about how we learn from the past to interact with the now.
Many thanks to Helen for giving us her time. And if you want to support Live Canon, go to their shows, buy their publications, and tune into their YouTube broadcasts. A poet who certainly does look back in order to look forward with his poetry is John Greening. Here he reads some of his poems and talks about his relationship to the canon.
Hello, this is John Greening, and I'm going to read you some poems which connect with the idea of what might be canonical, starting with the Anglo-Saxons, a poem called Brocken Woerde, which refers to a poem called The Battle of Maldon from the Anglo-Saxon period. My epigraph is from Seamus Heaney. He wrote, "The manuscript begins with 2 words which have stayed with me from the moment I first read them. Brocken Woerde. A causeway where the Norse raiders waded through mud. A curlew half starting up like a stubborn outboard motor. A copy of the Battle of Maldon, which you read aloud to the cold May wind. Northey admits nothing. As the sounds of Anglo-Saxon disperse, though the bullocks advance as we leave, as if we might offer them a translation, an explanation of what happens in the end, or know the truth about how, whatever it is, was broken." And Heaney himself, I suppose, is pretty canonical now, and this is a little homage to Heaney, literally called homage. Heaney, how can we hope to follow you across the bogland of this fool's-cap shire? The poet's Grimpen, the midden of the bards. Yet who else would we take for guide? Sure-footed as Wordsworth, and with Clare's blackthorn eye, iambically testing texture, surface, tension, prodding to gauge the weight and depth of every step. Your steady voice would charm through fret and whiteout, yet serenely chant a bullfrog chorus, whistle a black dog away, commune with bog people, with drowned forgotten poets, and the untuned ribs of stragglers still not quite returned from Troy. Canonical for me are the poets of the 16th and 17th centuries, and I like Philip Sidney, but his sister, Mary, is an interesting poet. Her main contribution was her versions of the Psalms, and this little sonnet is dedicated to Mary Sidney, or Mary Herbert, as she became, remembering her brother who died young, and I wrote it when I was at Hawthornden Writers' Retreat. Mary Sidney. That night no moon could brighten brought a moth to Spain's fire. But I have preserved Arcadia in these beds for him. Gardeners keep faith, though others lose it. How many pretty heads have been planted now? My brother's death still climbs the years with sad steps. These last threads of psalmody I sow for him beneath our lawns, our hedges. Turn on your radio. There is another life. I sing the Lord's song in a strange land, where your every breath will play back notes in consort with new words. Now find the key, and from that treacherous path, the lady walk, look down while fear and doubt are still in bud, and follow the river out. All these poems I'm reading, almost all these poems I'm reading, are from my selected poems, The Interpretation of Owls, which Kevin Gardner chose. So someone else choosing my work. So he was sort of establishing a canon of my own work, which was a rather strange experience. Back to those Elizabethans, Jacobeans. Ben Jonson's very important to me. And from a different book, a recent book called From the East. This is a little poem alluding to perhaps Jonson's most celebrated poem on the death of his son. And he was staying only a few miles from where we live, up the A1, when he got the news that his son had died. And this is about that. He was staying with Robert Cotton, one of the founders of the British Library. Up the road, where Robert Cotton spins and weaves a future British library out of what survives the wrecked monasteries, a group of men arrives, browsing, drinking, talking. One of them contemns all authors, not Ben Jonson, then storms to bed, raging through himself all night, and dreams of his boy, a child merely, in London, his small brow cut red as if a sword gave the blow and left him cross-marked like the London doors to show plague within. Ben Jonson runs to his friend, Camden, still up and reading, who'll surely understand, a wise man, a teacher. He says it's a trick of the mind. Be not disjected, Ben. But then the letters come, and Jonson reads the news of his first son, whom we remember only for a little poem. Well, sometimes what's canonical to one person is not to another. I've been fascinated for years by Akhenaten's Hymn to the Sun. My wife and I lived in Egypt for 2 years. One of the most important pieces of writing from ancient Egypt. It has been translated, but always into a very biblical register, and I thought I'd have a shot at it doing so with a slightly more contemporary note. So, a very important poem, but little known. To the Sun, after Akhenaten. Glorious as the hills in the east now, it spills light at sea level. Feast from its prehistoric silver plate, these dateless riches, released at last from the tyranny of sunlessness, of light starvation. A distant fact, an elephant in the room dictator, retiring, then flaring beyond the trace of any probe. We forget you, plugged into our electric shadow, drowning in dazzling gloom, asleep under sodium, among coiled, low-energy dreams. We dare not look at one another, unless it's through a screen. Strangers steal our identities, friends become spot, rash, stroke. Feverish, we forget that you have even set, and are rising already over Al-Hadr, the swastika lands, the dragon cities, the thorny paths of Wurio Pranili. But dawn comes, though we ignore its sacred polyphony, an alarm call from Star Trek, the kettle boiling, cars as they tick, the radio chatter. It will be hot. There will be flights towards your smile which says, I am here, behind ceiling tiles, rafters, insulation, slates and slaty rain clouds, beyond volcanic ash. Bathe, bask, bear all, ride your chariot, let us be gas guzzlers, my fingers touching that prominence to bless your bones and infiltrate the days, the years. And do not raise the subject X, the item gamma, as we apply the UV cream to our children by the sea. And do not listen to what follows the pips, the fission, ozone, carbon dioxide, fusion and confusion. Let the chick come unmutated from the egg. Let it come crowing. Crops must be warm. We must put up with polytunnels, keep the cliffs secure, till desert and its wildfires stagger over the horizon. Respect the winter. Don't give your smouldering horses rain such as will hurl us all to a solar arc. You watched us rise. Don't let us be washed away in rolling news. We do not understand the gravity of your stare, the currents above or below. We simply know time and tide. It never rains. Make hay. The switch that says on, off. We block. We quit the field. The turbines begin to turn, but you are the only God we believe in, even here in East Anglia, as on the West Bank. So as I say, as well as writing about some of the canonical authors, and I am quite a literary poet, I suppose, I do like to explore these other key poems from other eras. For example, I translated the Icelandic poem Völuspá, very important poetic Edda, but not generally known. So yes, it's a vexed question, what is the canon? But over the years, there's some agreement. Then, of course, we have to reconsider every few decades and look at things afresh. It was difficult for many women poets to emerge, and thank heavens they are now a natural part of the canon. Sylvia Plath, I don't think many people were ever in doubt that she was an extraordinary writer, and she certainly made an impression on me. This is a poem written ready for the anniversary of her death. Sylvia Plath. The snow flies in all directions, but doesn't settle, elusive as reputation. We all need a page to write our names on. Yours is on Primrose Hill, where Yeats left his chalk mark, and children who have never heard of either of you long to make a snowman. It's half-term. Those who are born that day are announcing their half-century on Facebook, a blue plaque in the cloud. Your sylvan rides turn to slush, pavement grey, until the next fall. 1 year in 10 there's such a winter. Warm yourself at the editorial bonfire. Watch the dying art of hedging and ditching. Forgive the crystal deceptions, and let Ariel go. So there are favourite poets as well as canonical poets, and sometimes the two things overlap. In my case, Yeats has always been there, though often at the margins of comprehensibility. This poem, Yeats's Tower, was written after visiting his famous tower. And it's, I think I'm right in saying it's all one sentence. Yeats's Tower. Climbing the sentence as well as climbing the tower. Steps that are hard to learn, but follow the master as he sits watching the dancer and the dance. Music passing under his window, and let your feet attempt the slippery winding rhyme and clause and line break up to the battlements, where you can see the whole country, where you can see the stars move in patterns everyone knows, but no one knows how to follow. So hard the steps. The whole business of writing sort of circles around the question of what's canonical, but you don't think about it when you're writing it yourself. You just go ahead and write. I'll finish with a Victorian poet, undoubtedly canonical, although he has his detractors over the years. This is Tennyson. I think it's long enough since he died for us to agree his greatness, though quite what that greatness consists of, people would disagree. His music, essentially, I think. Again, I responded to him by visiting the place where he was born. And it's another sonnet. I do seem to find myself writing the sonnet. The sonnet is a little sort of glass case for preserving reputation in, perhaps. I'm not the only one who's written about other poets in sonnet form. Think of Wordsworth to Milton, for example. So there's that conversation going on through time. So this one's called Somersby. And I quote a little Tennyson at the start. Root and all and all and all. A sonnet? Not out here. Even his wolds are Kraken and Excalibur, revealing, sinking back. Note as you approach a scowling face, an outcrop, carved legends, half-reaped fields, an empty settle. There's a babbling child's remembered brook. The font, a new style calling of kine in with a car horn, their line filing in search of its epic muse. She'll wait, holds the 6-bar gate and sings, but Tennyson, whose house is just below, beside the grange and opposite his father's tiny living. Do people love you still? High among crannies on the crazed green sandstone church tower, strange, that one perennial, bright, yellow, thriving.
Thank you to John Greening for a thoughtful and considered reading. Details of all the poets and their publications can be found at poetryworthhearing.biz. And now, Laura Varnam takes us back to the origins of English poetry with a challenge for the Beowulf poet.
Hello everyone, my name's Laura Varnam. I'm a poet based in Oxford, and I'm currently writing a collection inspired by the women of the Old English epic Beowulf. My poems, inspired by Grendel's mother, Beowulf's second antagonist in the poem, were published in Primer's Volume 7 from Nine Arches Press in August 2024, and I'm going to read from that sequence now, entitled Grendel's Mother Bites Back. Grendel's mother is often referred to as a monster in discussion of the poem, and she does take revenge when Beowulf kills her son, who has been terrorising the Danish kingdom for many years. But my poems explore her identity as a woman, a mother, and a figure who has been silenced, marginalised, and made into a troublesome other by the original poet, and indeed by later translators. The first poem I'll read is called Grendel's Mother Addresses the Author, and it deals with some of these questions. Grendel's mother addresses the author. For all your bluster, warrior poet, your puffed-up preening, your sword swagger and shield shuffling, you still won't look at me. Petrifying people, that's not my style. It's not my stare that needles your braggadocio. Any road, you started it. Edging me out, making me your Maark stapper, your boundary stalker, border controller. I never wanted to shoulder those lines. You kettle me into the corners of your compounds, tuck me into the bottom drawer of your word hoard, shushed and smothered by your fabrications. Water witch? She-wolf of the deep? Troll dam? Give over. Don't be so nesh. And the word nesh comes from my northern dialect, and it means weak or feeble and a bit of a wimp. The second poem I'll read is called Grendel's Mother Gets a Voice, and it imagines how it might feel to speak for the first time, and that might not be a straightforwardly positive process to suddenly be given a voice. Grendel's mother lives in a watery mere, and this poem also engages with the American feminist poet Adrienne Rich's poem, Diving into the Wreck. I use another Old English word in this poem, a wonderful verb, cleothroda, which means to make a noise. So this is Grendel's mother gets a voice. Grendles modor cleothroda, Grendel's mother sounded off. Now that I've finally got one, I don't know what to do with it. It's quite a responsibility, don't you think? Unlike a sword, it harbours no history. I can hardly bear it. Where to begin? I thought it would be mere clear diving into it, my boundless voice pooling and swirling, that I'd discover the mere maid and not the story of the mere maid. I'd surface and suddenly I'm mauling my metaphors. This is new to me. It's eyeing me up over there, lurking, like my son did. But I'm not going to natter on about him. You had that covered. Should I mother it, warm it in my gullet, hoard it from harm? The sound of it, cleothroda, all tongues and italics, catches in my craw. You'll be along soon to pocket it anyway. Monsters have no voice right. Perhaps I should eat it. The next poem I'd like to read is called The Name of the Father, which is a speculative exploration of Grendel's conception. We don't know who Grendel's father is in the original poem, and I wanted to think about a possible scenario. So this is called The Name of the Father. I was diving for oysters when it happened. Ocean-born, sea-sheltered, I would unseal my mouth to the sweet swell, take it all in. Then a man came, fretting at flesh, and dagger drawn stripped me to bone, wolfed me, lip-smacking, raw. Shucked and sucked dry, he was off and I sank, clinging to seabed, tide spiralling, in-curling, shell-shocked. Men do not know the name of Grendel's father. Women do not need to know. He made me a monster when he made me a mother. My brine baby, my salt in the wound. Another part of this project that's been really important to me as I've been writing is thinking about elegies. The elegy form is really important in Old English poetry, and memorialising rituals and elegiac poems are crucial both to the original Beowulf poem, but they're often reserved for men and not for women, and certainly not for monsters. So I'm going to end with two poems, one which is an elegy in Grendel's mother's voice, and one that is my elegy for her. This first poem is called An after annum, which is a line from Beowulf that was translated by W.E. Leonard as the lone one for the lost one. An after annum. When they tell me that grief's too cruel a companion, I scoff. She's the only company I've got. World is too wide and wheretofore without you in it. It gapes. There's no outwalking it. From seabed to seashore, earth's belly to mountain top, there is too much of me. Grief taps my scapula with calloused hand and tips her crown. Take this cup, my shoulder companion. It is yours to bear. And something I find very moving in the original Beowulf poem is the fact that women are often mourning the death of their kin. And this is something that links Grendel's mother with those other women, with the queens in the poem, and yet she has no one to talk to about her grief. So finally, my elegy for Grendel's mother. Let me sing of her glory now, how she came out of nowhere and cut them down to size, how I'd never seen the like of her, how she got away from this place and made them come to her, how she was only killed with her own sword and not their puny daggers, how they were too scared to deadhead her and carry her home to Heorot, how they can't stop talking shit about her. Let me sing of her glory here, before the woman becomes the myth, how we are made to forget.
Our next poet is Matt Bryden, whose poem is based on an episode from the Odyssey.
This poem refers to an episode in the Odyssey in which the king's daughter Nausicaa is visited in a dream by Athena to engineer her trip to the river, accompanied by some servant girls, ostensibly to wash some clothes for her brother and herself, but really, actually, to meet and assist Odysseus there. And the poem addresses how we may think we possess agency and autonomy, but actually it's the gods who write our script. Theophany. Your father, appreciative that you are of marriageable age, readies you a wagon to carry your fine clothes to the river, scarcely needs tell you the luminescence that precedes the appearance of a god, how from your party you might be singled out, your playmates' eyes still on the ball. And you waiting for a sailor to stumble from the bushes, bearded and unwashed, with a tale to furnish of his desolated men. And while you scan the shrubs and brush, you will barely notice the supportive grip under your shoulder that holds you firm, nor the straight-back razor tucked beneath your neck, the confounding, the understanding that comes with it.
Beck Reynolds gives us another feminist perspective as she picks a quarrel with Keats.
La Belle Dame speaks. Fledgling word weaver, dilettanti maladroit, You're not the first to entomb me in your verse. I'd wager you won't be the last. But if it's all the same, I'd rather ditch the facade erected by poets of the past. I'm tired of being shackled to fleeting I ams, forced to be a man's cautionary tale, typecast in the role of femme fatale before I could claim to be more than a child, contorting to fill a woman's guise. I didn't know better than to let myself be moulded into an object to be acquired, pandering to men who think it's flattery to say it was an ill day when they first saw your face. An ill day indeed. The truth is, no one shows little girls how to shed a shadow who claims his life will end without you. How was I to put up a fight when he insisted on taking my cries as a lover's lies, to be trampled by persistence? It was only when he pulled me down onto dewy meadow blades that I realised I never stood a chance. I was cast as the partner in this cursed dance from the moment his pen first produced me. So do not procure pity for a man that weeps when the birds do not sing. Their blood is on his hands. Their feathers decorate the land he journeys over, grinding bones into dust under his heel. For once, I want my story to feel like it belongs to me, not some cliché riding in on white steed they christen lover. We have suffered him enough to suffer loudly. If he seeks to inflict wounds on himself, let him be. Men like him have taken up enough space in poetry.
Margot Myers takes us from poetry to the visual arts as she takes the part of the artist's model against the artist in her version of Ford Madox Brown's Pretty Bar Lambs.
The Pretty Bar Lambs, after Emma Maddox Brown, 1851. There's no hidden meaning, you said. It's just a lady, a baby, some lambs and some grass. It's about capturing sunlight and shadows in pigments of green, blue, red, flake white, and Roberson's high gloss resin. But I'm no oil painting, I said, nor a vision. It's about my nose, hot blistering red, and poor Catty, starched, stiff as a rocket, her warm wet bottom such a weight in the crook of my arm, the sheep eating the geraniums, and how, even after all that, you said my mouth was never quite right.
Now, Nick Grundy gives a quick summary of some canonical favourites.
Verbal economy, getting your words worth. Windy day rewind. I saw lots of daffodils seeming to dance in the wind. Thinking of them still makes me smile. A touch of frost. The snowy woods look nice. My horse and I would linger, but we've got too much to do. Marvell soon under marble. We've no time for this slow wooing. We'll soon get old and die. So let's get physical now. Will and testament. Please don't mourn for me. Forget you ever knew me. Leave me to the worms. Quickly done. This flea bit us both, mingling our blood like marriage. Ah, your thumbnails just divorced us. By Byron by night. She walks at night time, a somnambulist, I think, and a very lovely one. Burns down the house. Oops, my plough's just destroyed a mouse nest, making her a homeless wee beastie. Sorry, but my worries are bigger than yours, my friend.
After that excursion into banality, republished from the current edition of Acumen, we have a lovely poem from Rosie Jackson, which honours the poet Catherine Bevis, whose death is still so recent.
Virgil, Dante, Flamingo. My love, when I die, I'll turn flamingo. Catherine Bevis, died 14th May 2024. That morning they were everywhere, lipstick pink, heads nodding on long necks as they twisted to watch the train, water up to their skinny shins, then in shop doorways, peering through glass. And when I opened my phone, I understood why. 6 a.m. that day, you turned flamingo, the colour of the dawn in summer. I was on my way to a talk about the influence of the classics on modern poets, the series named after Jackson Knight, who translated Virgil's Aeneid. I'm fond of Virgil, those haunting scenes where he falters through the underworld, searching for his dad, how the greyness does not deter him. No wonder he was sent as a guide to Dante in the Inferno, those circles as dark as the catacombs under Paris, where the living and the dead feed together. When Jackson Knight got stuck with his translation, he contacted Virgil through a medium, wanting the long-dead poet's guidance line after line. It's the kind of thing I might be tempted to do. But the audience tittered as if death's only certainty is to drive us off a cliff into a tongue-tied sea. So I turned down the volume to where you were, Catherine, tall and free, skimming through the darkness, your webbed feet pausing briefly on stepping stones of light. I could see your scalloped wings, smell the mud of the afterlife, the briny water, hear the squelch. I've always thought pink too girly, but now I remembered the picture of Dante in front of paradise, his long robe, that rich flamingo pink, and in that hour of seeing you, I knew it for what it was, the colour of love, of benediction. What a one-sided affair it is, this dialogue with the dead. How we're allowed to talk to you, yet if we claim to receive answers from the other side, it's seen as lifting the veil too far, as deluded as thinking flamingos have some kind of gravitas. But they do, Catherine. Thanks to you, they do. When I see them now, find a gaudy feather drifted onto my desk, or words that need no watering, I know it's a message from you. And the heaviness lifts a little, the missing, the riddle.
And finally, back to the beginnings of English and the Venerable Bede with Inge Milfull.
Death is the outside. After a passage in Bede's ecclesiastical history. Thus spoke one of the king's counsellors. Life seems to me to those who linger in it, as if we huddled inside in the winter season, sheltering together against sharp showers in the walls of the house in harsh weather. And a bird blundered in, blackbird or sparrow, driven through the doorway by the dreary onslaught, flitted among rafters randomly roaming, hovered near the hearth where the heat rises, then blundered out through the back door. The soul's image, we have all seen such, off again into the unknown.
And that's it for this very packed episode. Remember, information on poets and publications and the texts of unpublished poems can be found on poetryworthhearing.biz. I hope you've enjoyed listening.